Welcome to our class. In this class, I would like to give you an overview of the concept of form validation. So here we see a registration form, and we also see some error messages because the user has not filled out the form correctly. So the goal in form validation is to make sure that the required fields are filled in and that the values are in the correct format if that is a requirement. The problem that we face is that we need to keep the form from being submitted until it is filled in correctly. So that form needs to stay inside the web page until the user has correctly filled everything in. So here we see the basic form tags, and in our opening form tag we have an action which indicates the script to process the form, and the method, which will be a post or get depending on how we wish to send the data. You will also usually have a name and an ID for your form. The issue is, which type of button will we use? Will we use input type equals submit or input type equals button? Input type equals submit will call the action of the form. Input type equals button does not call the action of the form. And there are pros and cons to both methods. Here we see our registration form, and when I click the button, I see the error messages. So the form stays here until I fill in everything correctly. Notice it doesn't really care what values I put as long as I put something. If we look at the source code, we are using input type equals button. Therefore, in our JavaScript, we need to actually call the action of the form by using the submit method. Here we see a form that uses input type equals submit for the button. If I click the register button without filling anything in, it will automatically call the action of the form. That is the default behavior of input type equals submit. It will call the action of the form automatically, regardless of whether we have validation error messages. So how do we keep this form here while the user validates it? So input type equals submit automatically calls the action of the form, and the values are submitted to the server. Here is an example using a different form, and as you can see, there are values in the fields, and we can see those values being sent paired with the names of the form elements. So every form element has a name attribute, and it is paired with the value that the user entered or the value that corresponds to the checkbox or the radio. So the problem with using input type equals submit is that the form is automatically submitted. So we need to use the return JavaScript keyword, which will prevent the default behavior. So return false will prevent the form from being submitted, and it will keep that form on the page. Once the form has been filled out correctly and the error messages have all been displayed and then removed, we need to use return true. Return true will enable the form to be submitted. Input type equals button is just a generic button that will execute whatever JavaScript we want. It is actually easier to use a generic button than the submit button. However, in this case, we need to write some code using JavaScript to submit that form to the action after we are finished validating it. So here we see our form with input type equals button, and in our JavaScript code, we would be using the click event to call the function that would validate that form, and it would just execute the statements one by one until everything has been filled out correctly. Finally, we need to submit that form, and the submit method is a method of the form object, so we would use the ID of that form to submit it. Now if we were to use type equals submit, things are a little different. Although we could still use the click event of the submit button, you generally see developers using the onSubmit event of the form. So this is an event of the form, and it is calling the exact same function that you have in the previous example. The difference being that we are not just using our true-false variable to determine when to submit the form, but we also need to use our return false and return true keywords. So if there is a problem and the error messages are still there, we need to use return false. That will stop the default action of the form. Once everything is filled out correctly, we use return true, which calls the action of the form, and the values are submitted to the server. There are many different ways of displaying error messages and checking fields, so you will see a lot of variation on the web with respect to form validation. I am trying to point out the differences in the two different buttons and how you approach form validation using both input type equals submit and input type equals button, and I have examples in the sample code displaying this.